hello. Hope you've all enjoyed dinner by now. Hope the food coma is not too bad. If it is, it's fine. I can live with that. Be happy. I'm Fotis Papadogeorgopoulos. As was said earlier, I come from Greece. I live here in Finland, just so I can talk at Close to Trade 2019, or not really, but. And I work at Futurize. And I'm here to talk to you about accessibility, and in particular, keeping sites accessible with types. But one of the first things I would like to understand first, before this talk, is how many of you work on the front end, like in a website on the front end? OK, that's a good, wow, that's a big number than I thought. That's great. And how many of you know about accessibility? Ooh, still a big number of people. I'm very positively surprised. Cool. One of the things that I want to make clear to you today is accessibility is a very large topic, and I'm not going to be covering all of it. In particular, the thing I'm going to be talking to you about is the thing that I have struggled a lot with in the last 2 years, which is keeping sites accessible. Making sites accessible, I think, definitely takes effort, especially earlier on in a project's lifecycle than later on. But the question I've been asking myself quite often is how can we keep websites accessible when, with limited accessibility expertise available and with large numbers of people working on the web today. The way I have found that to be good is with types, but there can also be other solutions. So please, I understand there's different ways to solve this problem. It's fine. This works for me and the teams I work with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit briefly about accessibility on the web. Accessibility on the web is a lot about communicating information to users, essentially. For a lot of users, this is with visuals. You see the button, you're like, that's a button, if hopefully it's styled like a button, and you can use it. But for a lot of users, they have to rely on assistive technologies, which is special pieces of software that read the structure of the document, and they're able to present that information in a usable way. For example, commonly we say that we're trying to communicate a name, a role, and some sort of value for an interactive widget on the screen. And not everything on the screen is necessarily interesting, like empty divs are not really interesting, but buttons probably are. So if you had a button that said book tickets, and then with a screen reader, which is, again, a piece of assistive technology that reads out the content of the page, it would say book tickets button, and by the way, since it's a button, you can press enter or space to activate that. There's a sort of contract going on there. If you want a little bit about the details, and I apologize, this slide, you should probably look at it right to left, is that you have in the web document, you have the button as the markup. The browser knows to parse that into the name and the role, and that's because you have the default HTML button, which then the operating system has different APIs, and the screen readers and assistive technologies interface with that. So they see that, oh, hey, I got a button whose name is foo. I know what to tell the user to do with that. There's a fantastic article by Melanie Richards on a list apart called Semantics to Screen Readers that covers that. So if that sort of thing interests you, I would highly recommend that you read it. And commonly, with accessibility, we have a sort of cake or pyramid or whatever you want to call it. If we're talking about exposing the roles and the names and the values to people, then there's sort of these layers of how you can achieve that. So HTML plays a very important role there, because a lot of the default and built-in HTML elements, they expose a lot of these things correctly. So buttons, they're operable by clicking, or with a, enter and space keys. And commonly, when people implement those in JavaScript or in some custom behavior, they forget to handle enter or space or both of them sometimes. And that's something that the default button gives you by default. CSS also has a role to play. Of course, it's nice if buttons, look like buttons. And the sort of styling you do on the web is with that. JavaScript also has a role to play in accessibility. Quite often, a negative role, if implementing custom things without considering how the semantics get exposed. But very often, it does have a good role, because a lot of the things that have to do with state, right? Like how the DOM changes, like an array expanded of true or false for a collapsible section, you're going to need JavaScript to do that. Like, you could probably do it with some weird CSS hack, but not recommended, because again, you're not exposing the roles and the values to people. And for all of these, I'm saying HTML and CSS and JavaScript. In fact, the code examples I'll show you today are in Elm, because this is what all of these things end up in the browser. No matter how you end up doing it, still that. And I would wager even when WebAssembly had host bindings, they would still be working pretty closely like that. And finally, we have ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. You might have seen those as attributes on HTML quite often, and a lot of people tend to think that accessibility is ARIA. It's not. ARIA is a specific set of markup that fills in holes in a way in HTML. HTML currently, maybe in the future it will cover more of these things, but there are certain states and roles that HTML by default does not provide, and it's for those cases that using ARIA is a really good idea, because then you can communicate more useful things to users. And you'll see even later on that we don't have actually much ARIA use in these examples. So what are some common issues in accessibility? The issues I'm going to tell you are really, really common, and for many accessibility practitioners, not super interesting. However, they're common, and they do affect users concretely. And I think it's important that we are able to address these like common and, I would say, simple in many ways issues, such that people have, concretely a better experience right now. So one of the things that is very important is heading order. We all know headings in HTML, H1 to H6. They're supposed to be nested consistently. And if you were to remove them, you would should still be able to get an understandable outline of the document. So if you think of headings in HTML as giving you the table of contents, that is kind of how they're supposed to do that. And the reason is that, well, for sighted users, it helps to navigate and orient themselves. But also for assistive technology users, there are many modes that can navigate by headings. They can jump to headings, which really helps when you have complex websites. It's very, very important. So you see in this example on this basketball site I've worked on, we have a heading 1 of information about the tour. Heading 2, there's a sort of dunk competition, and heading 3 is more details about that. What should not happen in the picture that you're seeing right now is jumping from H1 to H4, because that is quite confusing, and it kind of makes the document outline a bit nonsensical. Like, you would not see it as something valid to jump to if it was an H4, maybe. It doesn't destroy it, but again, it can be really confusing when you look at the table of contents and it's jumbled, right? And the second thing that I'm going to talk to you about is form labels. Form labels, again, the text above the form, they provide visual guidance to sighted people, and also to assistive technologies users, labels bestow an accessible name to the inputs. So for example, if I were to focus this input field up there, it would say text input, username or email, which is the name bestowed by the label, and by the way, it's empty. You haven't put anything into it. It's probably going to tell me also some focus and form controls that we don't need to worry about right now. And that's not the only reason to have labels, by the way. Like, you can imagine, for even sighted users, if you have to book flight tickets, and flight tickets are expensive, or I don't know, flight tickets back home for me are expensive, and you get stressed. And because there are no labels, you don't know if you're filling in your first name or your last name. If you get that wrong and you need a passport to go to a country, that can cost you a lot of money, not to say time and so on. So like, labels have a really important role to play for everyone, not just assistive technologies. It's not just to be proper. Also, another fun benefit of that, if you label things correctly, password managers can pick up on things, which again can improve fill rates and stuff. And yet, more than 50% of the home pages on the web don't have labels, like 50%. Now, I don't believe that 50% of home pages on the web set out to make an accessible website, or at least I choose to believe that, or I hope to believe that. But I can understand deeply how it happens, right? I can empathize with this idea that, it's on a tight deadline, or maybe the design wanted something, or maybe the developers forgot, or any of those ideas. Maybe the label IDs were wrong. So it's common, and it's important. And the third thing I'll talk to you about is missing image alternative text. Now, alternative text is a sort of description that you can give to images if they are content. So if an image is content, you can describe this image. And if an image is decorative, you should empty out the alt text so that it's not. What should not happen is that the alt text is missing. If the alt text is missing, commonly, it's a bit of undefined behavior. In a screen reader, you will hear the name of the image. So you'll hear abcdef13.jpg. That means nothing. Actually, it's funny because it means less than nothing, because you're not sure if at that point it's an image that's content and you're missing out on it, or it's just taking up, headspace. So less than nothing. You heard it here first. And yeah, missing image alt text, 68% of home pages of the web don't have it. And again, right, this thing, image alt text is very context dependent. You might have a picture of a dog, and if you're on a camping website, it's probably decorative and you can skip it, but it might be a site about dogs, in which case, describe that cute dog. So they're very context dependent, and that's why I can sort of understand well, I don't know if 68%, but the high rates of missing image alt text. And anyway, on a bad day or a tight deadline, even the most diligent person will get things wrong. Like, of course, none of us wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go and write some inaccessible sites. Like, I hope we don't. I mean, maybe, I don't know. You do you. But the thing is that we've all had, days when we're tired, when we're down, days when a PO is breathing down our necks, and they're like, I need this done by yesterday. It happens. And in those cases, when it happens, that is where I found types to be really useful. I find types really, really useful to encode these essential human values in the system, right? To say, we care a lot about accessibility in these concrete cases, and thus we're going to make sure that something at the type level is going to stop you from doing the wrong thing, essentially. So we're offloading something of that to the computer. I'll give you some concrete examples, again in Elm, and I would also recommend that don't focus too much on the examples. I would like you to take the idea away from this. There's many different APIs and ways you could do this, and I understand that you might have different preferences than others. So having said that, heading level, we can make a custom type, heading 1 to 6, and then we can have some hx function that basically recreates the HTML headings. That's not very interesting by itself. However, we might have more styled headings and subheadings in our system. Maybe we have a certain design that is hopefully consistent through our site. And in that case, you can take these headings and keep propagating this heading level, right? Like these headings and subheadings, they're styled in a certain way, and they also have a specific level. Ideally, you would be tying the styling to it as well, but I don't know, in projects I've worked on, we haven't had that time of bliss yet, so your mileage may vary. And where it really gets interested is when you have reusable functions, components, views, whatever you want to call them, that have nested sections within them, right? Imagine you have something that can display different data, then it really helps to say that this nested section has other headings inside of it. And the only way you can know what's the correct heading level for the nesting is to know the heading level at the top. So if you have this heading level in your system, then you can do the math and figure it out sort of automatically. And then when somebody goes to use this nested section, and I have to say, I love Elm type errors, it's just going to tell you, hey, you tried to give me an attribute. You got ahead of yourself and started giving me styles or something, but I need you to tell me the heading level first. And that's fantastic. Like, that's catching an error right at the beginning. And again, like, you can imagine that it's not just you being tired. Maybe somebody just joined the project, right? And they ran into this, heading level. It's a first-class value in this system. It means that it's important. It's a very clear signifier reading the code that we care about this shit. Second thing I'll show you, and here definitely, like, I'm convinced there's enough ways to have a form on a page as there are sites out there. So please take the APIs with a grain of salt. There are 2 ways or 5 ways. I'm going to show you 2 ways of associating an input with a label. The first one is to put the label text inside of the input inside of the label element itself. That automatically bestows the name. The second way would be to associate it by a DOM ID, just a string basically, and to have the for attribute on the label. So it's a label for something. Again, we can do the same thing, give an input label method type that is either embedded label with a string or label by ID with some custom type of DOM ID. And then when you create these inputs, and we were talking about sort of mid-level inputs. We're not necessarily talking about the input that the person is going to use every time, but something that you will use as a fundamental building block in your application. And then having this input method, you can match and do the actual DOM stuff. So in the first case, you see embed label text. We put the text inside of the label, and we're done. And for more complex cases, which it can happen if you want to style radio buttons and stuff like that, you can do a lot of nice tricks with associating labels like this, where you can use the labeled by ID. Can have an input label, and sure enough, in actual use case, you'll see in the first case I have an email with an embedded label. And in the second case, I have the label separately. I give it a DOM ID that I have constructed, and again, many different ways to do this. Its text is name, and then I have the input which I'm declaring that it's labeled by a name label ID. And like this, again, will give you type errors if you try to have labels without IDs, or without accessible names, essentially. And this is something that actually, like a variation of this happened to me one day, that a coworker says, hey, I have this error about labels. What do I do? Like, what is this weird input label method? I never saw that before. But that, to me, is a really good opportunity, because then it's like, oh, like, embedded labels might be simpler. Oh, by the way, we also have more higher-level functions, like email input, flat number input, stuff like that, that really you don't need to think about adding the label, so maybe you can use one of these. And in any case, we're human beings, let's look at it together. And I can't stress to you how important I think this is. Like, just this idea that says that we care about these labels in this code base, and it's perfectly fine not to know how to do it or what its role is. Like, it's something that we, in our code, like leaving the code base, you've left behind something important about the people who will use it. And the final example I will show you is the image. So for images, you can say that you have a purpose, a decorative or content. If it's decorative, you will see that I actually empty out the HTML alt attribute. It's very different. Like, empty string on alt is very different than not having alt. Not having alt is the undefined behavior I told you about the name of the image. Having an empty alt says this is decorative. Kind of annoying, but hey, that's why we have an image component in our application that takes care of it. And like, the person who uses an image doesn't have to know this thing, which is great in a way. If they're curious, they can always look at the code, and hopefully, we've left comments to talk about that. And yes, in actual use case, initially I have an image that's just a kitten and it's decorative. In the second case, I have, the tops of colored buildings lit by sunset, which is probably some photo I have taken. And in the third case, I have an error, which, again, loving Elm type errors, it will very nicely tell me that, hey, you again tried to give me attributes and you didn't tell me what my purpose is, which is exactly the thing I worry about when I go to sleep at night. So yes, what is my purpose? And again, similar discussions with people, like, what does this purpose thing mean for images in the system? You can have a nice discussion about it. And I think images are especially important because images are so context sensitive, sorry. Like, you can have SVG images, which are commonly in buttons, and then sometimes you have text and sometimes you don't. And if you don't have text, they should bestow an accessible name. If you have text, you don't need it, stuff like that. Very context sensitive. So having this, wake-up call whenever you try to use it, I think is really, really important. And again, you can see similar things for SVG images. Fun fact about SVG images, there are way more ways of giving them accessible names than this. Like, SVG is kind of HTML adjacent in that. The way I'm doing it right now is by setting aria hidden and aria label, which I think is the only use of aria in these demos. Aria hidden says disregard this whole thing. Aria label says, hey, here's an accessible name for you. Pretty much. There's different ways to do that, and I have some references at the end by Sarah Swade and Scott O'Hara that have written about that. But you will notice that the interface is the same, right? Like, you take a purpose and you get some sort of icon. So fundamentally, whether you want to include that's how you create a home icon, let's say. But fundamentally, if you want to include an image as a source or an image as an SVG, you have the same kind of conditioning about how to think about it in the system. So again, you'll see here I might have a home icon and standalone content of home because there's no other text. In the second example, I actually have the text of home, so I can just say that the image is decorative. It really doesn't do anything. You probably don't want to announce home, home to screen readers, although screen reader users, apologize. Maybe it's not the end of the world, but And oh yeah, TypeScript. So another fun fact is, I don't even know if this code compiles properly, but I do use TypeScript quite a lot in my day-to-day work. And in TypeScript and React, you can have SVG images and co directly as components, basically. And there you can do something similar. Again, if like the Elm version had 4 ways to do it, this probably has 10 ways of doing it. So please use your favorite way of doing it. But fundamentally, it's the same thing, right? That whenever you try to include an SVG in this system, you get this, this heads up that, hey, tell me what my purpose is. And you might be thinking that the next few slides would be, really going down into this idea of using these types to solve accessibility issues. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of more interesting problems that you can solve with types and accessibility. But I don't want to go down that way today. Not just because we're kind of at a closer conference, but I think there's something more interesting to talk about here. And in accessibility, I think there is a lot of expertise that is sometimes visible and appreciated, but very, very often it's not. It's not visible. So much of the work is in the markup. Like, we were building these really elaborate tables last year, and we tried so hard to make them accessible. They were sortable, flippable, and so on. Showed them to the client. They told me, hey, this looks good. Which is fair. Like, that's the measure by which we judge things in a way. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that much of the accessibility work that goes on is invisible. And we're talking about people testing with screen readers and compatibility issues, much like we have actual browser testing and so on. And I think types can help ask the right questions. When in a team setting, I don't think I haven't found it useful to have a situation where you have a team of 8 people, like I have at work, and to have, Fotis in the corner doing the accessibility. Like, maybe that will help the site concretely when you're building it, but I really don't believe that it's going to stay accessible. And importantly enough, I think there's a way better way to do that. Like, if you have the types such that, somebody runs into this, like you as the, person who knows about accessibility or something, can encode these values in the system. And then when people run into these problems, they can come and find you and can have a much more useful discussion out of it, because you're not discussing in the abstract anymore. You're talking about that thing on that page that they try to put in. I found it a really good way. Like, I genuinely feel so happy when I go to work these days and I hear people talking about labels on buttons without me having to intervene. It's fantastic. And I think types, then, in that situation, help make the work visible. There are different ways to do it again. I'm sure you could probably do it with good API design and not types or something like that. But regardless of what you choose, I think they really help bring this work into the light and bring up this consideration in people's minds. So much of this work, like this high percentages I showed you, right? They're not people getting up in the morning to write bad code. There are people who might not know about it, who might have a tight deadline and so on. And thus, helping people build an intuition about this thing is how I'm pretty convinced is a good way to go about solving this. I have some references. Tessa Kelly's would be remiss to go through this talk and not mention her. She has made an accessible HTML package in Elm, which is really fantastic. If you've tried to test accessibility, you might know that it's quite hard, and you can only catch 30% of the errors. This is the best thing I have found. You literally change the imports from the default HTML to accessible HTML, and you get type errors. And because it's Elm, you fix the things, and it works. And I love it. It's such a good library. And also conceptually as an idea and exploration. So if you're wondering what else you could do with types and accessibility, that might be something to check. Sarah Sweden and Scott O'Hara, they had a pair of articles talking a lot about context and ways of marking up things and so on. Really in depth, both of them. I think you should check them out. As for me, that has been my talk. Thank you very much. One question. Person.
Thank you for your talk. That was interesting. If you have a tight deadline, won't your colleagues find ways to work around these types, like pass content with an empty string or something?
Sure, yes, they could. I would hope they would not. And again, we're talking about, it depends on when you do this, right? If you do this the day before the deadline, you add the types. Maybe not, you're right. But I mean, if you have it, even for a short period, I would say, it doesn't take too long until people build an intuition about it in a way. So yeah, I mean, maybe not add them the day before, I would say. But no, on a tight deadline, I think fixing this takes nothing, asking yourself whether this image is content or not. doesn't take that much in the long scheme of things. Like, it's probably faster than forgetting about it and having to fix it later in a way. So yeah, I think in practice for me it has been quite okay. And yeah, you know, depending on the language that you use, it might be easier or harder to like see the types. But again, I question whether people would really do that. That hasn't been my experience in a way.
Okay, thanks for this.
Cool.